Welcome to another episode of Lean in Leander. When I was preparing for this episode, one thing kept going through my mind, and it was something that a lot of us might be familiar with. It was the song from Sesame Street, "Who Are the People in Your Neighborhood?" Now, the reason that was going through my mind was probably because I wanted to be a Muppet when I was a little kid, but beyond that, it was something that just kind of echoed in my head as I went through this process. Now, I had the opportunity to meet one of my neighbors and get to know him a little bit better, and that neighbor is who I'm bringing to the podcast today. He's a gentleman by the name of D. Mills. Now, Dee and I were familiar with each other from neighborhood events and, just the general pleasantries that you'll exchange with a person as you walk by their home. But he had posted something in our social media here in our community indicating that he was looking for a way to be able to promote Doctors Without Borders. Now, I'm familiar with Doctors Without Borders. I can't claim to be an expert, but I knew that it was an organization that made a huge impact in the refugee crises around the world. And I was really interested to understand exactly what Dee did in that regard. It seemed to me interesting. Someone down my street, just a few houses, who's involved with Doctors Without Borders. And what I found was something that was far beyond what I expected in the initial conversation. Dee not only is a really, really interesting guy, what he does with his time and his commitment to the community at large is really quite striking. And it's something we should all maybe strive towards as we do our day-to-day. So Dee himself is actually a veteran. He was in the Air Force, and he was 22 years in the Air Force, actually. He served as an Air Force pilot and also weapons maintenance. He was an officer, and he was originally in the European theater. He actually served in Desert Storm, Bosnia-Serbia conflict, Iran and Iraq. And prior to leaving the military, was really positioned to be a very highly decorated officer. But he would have had to go back into war zones, and it was something that he wasn't really willing to do. So he stepped away from his military career, which I think is extensive and deserves praise, and started to go down a different path. He was looking for a way to be able to contribute, and he found Doctors Without Borders after a couple of other very, very nice social engagements. Doctors Without Borders became something that he now contributes to and spends his time and his money supporting. So we're going to sit down with Dee, find out a little bit about him, and then talk a little bit more about Doctors Without Borders. I encourage you to stay tuned to the podcast at the end, because I'm actually going to give you some websites and some other information if you're so inclined to support Doctors Without Borders, which I encourage, or if you're looking maybe to volunteer your own time. It's really something that's a very worthy cause and can use more Americans. As Dee will tell you, Americans are probably the least likely to participate in Doctors Without Borders. So something for you to think about, and I hope you find this episode very interesting. I know I did. Stick around at the end, get some more information. So I'm here with my neighbor, Dee Mills. Dee, thank you so much for joining me here on Lean in Leander. Appreciate the time.
Good to be here.
Fantastic. So we've had an opportunity to have a little bit of a conversation over the past few days, a little bit more about Doctors Without Borders and your general story, which I found extremely interesting. You're a very, very interesting man, and I'm happy to have made your acquaintance, and I'm glad that we're friends now. There's a lot of things that we could talk about, but I really want to try to kind of keep it on topic. So let's start with a little bit of your history. And it's really interesting where you've come from.
Yes.
And how long have you been in Leander now?
A little over a year and a half.
Okay.
We were in Virginia for about the past 15 years, and then my wife and I decided to pull up stakes and come here because this is my home.
Okay. So originally from Texas then?
Yes. Yeah,
okay.
My father was at base, Bergstrom, where the hotel is.
Okay.
He retired from that base, and then they went and got a ranch out near San Marcos, and I was off at college doing what I did.
Very nice, very nice. I hadn't made that connection quite yet because I know you've mentioned UT a couple of times. And,
okay, yeah.
So you were in Texas. Went to college. You were involved with ROTC and things like that. Then you did some time in the military, correct?
Yes, I had 22 years in the Air Force.
Well, thank you for your service, as they say.
You're welcome. Very welcome. Time the spouses also. I try to tell everybody who I said thank you for your service. I try to tell them thank you for your service, especially for your spouse.
Right, right. No, for sure, for sure. It's a sacrifice. I mean, that's
Yes.
definitely not for everyone, for sure.
No.
But those who take that particular pathway, I always, it deserves the respect that it deserves, because it's a really hard thing. That's a hard job to do. It's a hard job to do, for sure. But so your military career, I know you stepped away from the military at a point, a personal decision, work-life balance type thing.
Mm-hmm.
But you advanced pretty well in the military.
I was fortunate. I think in the Navy they call it fleeting up. For me, I was actually below the zone promoted to major, then lieutenant colonel, and did all of the things. You filled all the squares you have to fill, and enjoyed every bit of it. I deployed quite a bit, some staff time, and after my 22nd year, they wanted to promote me to colonel and send me back to the Middle East, and I said, no, it's time to stay here.
Right. At that point, you've done your bit, right?
Yes.
I hesitate to say you've had your fill, because it sounds like you enjoyed your time in the military, but
the flying was great, the people were great. It's a good mission.
And it was Air Force, right?
Yes, Air Force.
Okay, all right. So I know we've talked a little bit about this, you and I, but you did some sorties and that type of stuff, right? Where you were second in the cockpit.
Yeah, we were F-15Es, a weapons systems officer, sits behind the pilot. It's similar to the Navy and the Tomcat, where the front is person, then the weapons, and I hate to use the term Top Gun, but it's that way.
Okay.
I was in the front and weapons officers in the back.
Okay.
I was in the front for 4 years, and then another year and a half in the back seat.
Okay. So you actually flew as a pilot.
Yes.
You were actually doing. I've always loved the Air Force.
Oh,
I would
yeah.
have loved to have gone into the Air Force. Honestly, that if I was ever considering military, it was definitely the Air Force. But at the time, no corrective surgery for the 2020 had to be 2020. So you couldn't.
No, you
Couldn't get in if you didn't have 2020. And I wanted to fly. So.
Yes. Well, and I find out it's there's a good reason for it. There were some friends that started losing their eyesight once, or just worked 2020 and they had to get out, and unfortunately, they weren't flying anymore. So I was actually very lucky.
Well, that's cool. That's cool. So, any just for the sake of a good story, any good flight stories?
I try to think. We deployed so many places here at home and also overseas. I think the best story I have was we were flying from Bitburg, Germany, coming back to the States. We were 10 F-15s, and we were coming home. And about halfway across the Atlantic, my number one engine started basically breaking. It was stopping. So I had to shut down the number one engine, and we still had another 4 hours to get anywhere. So we followed the procedure, and I had to egress, or I had to separate myself from the other 10, and we ended up going to Keflavik, Iceland on one engine.
Okay.
And it was interesting, but you train for that.
Right.
You actually train for that, and I've had losses, engine losses before, but that was a long way away from everything. So,
Right.
Yes. So it was a good story, good people that were at Keflavik. So it was definitely interesting.
So when you get to Iceland, they just basically, you have to wait there till your plane's repaired, or how's that work?
Well, we always take 2 ships. So when I had the problem, I had another guy that would go with me, like wingman.
Mm-hmm.
We had to wait until the Air Force guys from Langley, since it was F-15s, flew out and changed the engine. So we were there for 2 days and got a new engine and flew back to the States where we were going. So, these guys are great.
Had you ever been to Iceland, like, on purpose?
No.
Okay, all right.
No.
So it was a nice aside, regardless of the actual seriousness of the trip itself.
Yeah, they're great people. Really good people.
That's great. So, Doctors Without Borders. One of the things I understand from our conversations is, first of all, you have already a very philanthropic approach to things. I know that you volunteered in several missionary type opportunities before you got involved with
Right.
Doctors Without Borders. So help us understand a little bit how you got involved with that organization itself.
The issue of refugees started when I was actually deployed to Italy, and it was a Bosnia Kosovo war, and we were responsible for getting some of the refugees out of the Kosovo area. At that point, looking at how people are treated when they aren't similar to the other people, and in war, it's very brutal, and that was a very brutal war. It made an impact on me because I wanted to make sure that whatever I did, that I could give back to the people that I saw there, the people that I met. So at that time, when I was still in the military, I started doing mission work, pretty much in country, but I had made it out to a couple other locations. So that was probably the one that got me, the situation that got me interested in refugees and things like that.
So interesting from there, obviously that exposure to, I won't try to sugarcoat it, to the suffering of people.
Yes.
Largely not by their own hand. These are circumstances that are thrust upon them by other situations.
And that's probably the best way to put it, is there's nothing that they did, there's nothing that they were criminals or anything. It was just a different religion, and they were in places where people didn't want them.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to be the ticket to several places all over the place.
Right.
So that was probably the thing I took best from that, was there's a lot of people out there doing this, and I'm going to be one of the ones that at least tries to do something to help.
Right, maybe kind of balance the scales, so to speak.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very much so.
Okay. So then, obviously, your lifetime continues. You have a couple of other interests in the meanwhile, and then have an opportunity. I believe it was a friend of yours who first exposed you to Doctors Without Borders. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. Mike and I had been parallel in our careers in the Air Force. Mike was a great guy. We did so much together. I had actually gone to Kiev, to work with missions, Doctors Without Borders, but the Children of the Street. Did that a couple of times, and it was basically looking for the kids that were orphaned or throwaways, and it was an interesting enterprise. It was an interesting experience because these throwaways, nobody wanted them. And I think I told you the story where we got a call from the police in this town that they found two small children that were staying in an abandoned building with three men, and they were calling us to go get them. Usually you do that to the police and tell them they go get them,
Mm-hmm.
but we went and picked up the two young ladies and brought them back to the Village of Hope. So that was something I think was the strangest thing, is that we had to go and get them instead of the police doing that.
Interesting.
Yeah, and Mike was a big part of telling me and getting me interested, not just with that, but also with doctors.
Okay. And then you had some opportunities to get involved with Doctors Without Borders. I believe, was it first in Greece or?
Yes, it was first in Greece. They have people streaming out of it at that time. It was Syria, Iraq, and places like that. And I went into Greece to the main office and talked to them about where I could do some best, where I could help them the most. At that time I was certified medical paramedic, so they wanted me to see what I could do to help with the medicine or the medic part of it. We stayed at a refugee camp near Athens, which was huge. They all are huge, and I got to do some there, but the call, at least Mike and I felt the call to go out to where the refugees were actually coming to the islands and help them. That's the steps that took me out to the islands.
So, obviously, I'm sure a question would come up if you're listening to this, and I already know the answer, but to help people understand. So, while your training in the military was, obviously flight, logistics, I would assume.
Very much so.
How did the medical part of this become part of your acumen?
in the Air Force, you have to take so much of a course in case you have to deploy or you're punching out of an airplane. There are things that you have to do to keep yourself trained, and if you're with somebody else, it's called self-aided buddy care. And from that, you can get as far as doing things that you help with some other people that were there or in your unit. And I had volunteered previously with sheriff's departments in Florida. I was a scuba diver, and I did a lot of work with the search and rescue there. So that's really what got me interested in it. Is I think, as you said, giving back.
So you are like a paramedic then, or?
I actually got my paramedic rating when I was in the States.
Okay.
And I volunteered even in Langley and also down at Panama City, Florida, with the sheriff's departments. So my certification meant I could go with the squads, EMSs, and things like that. And I was a volunteer at that time, which was really an eye-opening event, especially with the late night being as it is and things that come out late night. So I volunteer usually Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, and my wife was understanding it was something I wanted to do.
So you took the weekends.
Well, the weekends were the place where they really needed it. So it was one of those, I could do during the week, but it's not going to be as active as the weekends.
Right. Yeah, no, I can only imagine. And frankly, I've probably had a weekend or two where I was maybe close to paramedics, but didn't quite get the chance to meet you.
Yes.
So it's another story for another day. So again, let's kind of bring it back around to the Doctors Without Borders themselves, because I think the organization in and of itself, I'm familiar with it. I knew once we had the conversation. It was kind of funny because I had been thinking about, okay, what do I do next? Who do I talk to next? And you had posted something about, hey, I'm looking for some opportunities to talk about Doctors Without Borders, and I'm like, holy cow. My neighbor down the street is involved with this international organization. That has to be fascinating. And but not a lot of people in America are necessarily that familiar with Doctors Without Borders.
No, it's not.
So tell us a little bit about the organization itself.
Okay, I'm sorry, but I have to take a break.
No, go ahead.
Doctors Without Borders, that first Mike and I were in Athens, and I got to meet some of the folks that were in that program there. And I became more and more interested. I'd actually gone back to the States after I'd been over there for a while, and actually started calling some folks in the area about Doctors Without Borders. And you're right, there was not really a whole lot of people that in the near area that knew about it or had any dealings with it. So I had to call some of the regional centers, and at that time I was in Florida, and that regional center was going to be up in Atlanta. So I went up to Atlanta and got the tour of everything that they do, and I was just so touched that the need out there was so great and so much needed that it's definitely what I wanted to do. I had the skills to do it. I was blessed enough that I had the training, I had the time that I could put to it, and it was definitely something that I was interested in doing. At that time, if I'd gotten out of the Air Force at the time, I probably would have done that. But at that time, the Desert Storm kicked off, so I would have to put that off for a while.
So again, when you're dealing with the refugee crises, in Greece, I would say probably I would hazard to guess that a lot of people are completely unaware of the fact that there's a refugee crisis in Greece.
Yes.
Now, to complicate matters, the Greek government has been less than stellar the past couple of decades, so there's a lot of problems within Greece itself. So Greece does not have the wherewithal necessarily to address some of these refugee issues and whatnot. So I'm sure that they rely or lean heavily on organizations such as Doctors Without Borders.
Yes, it's because we do a lot of work that I do, or Doctors Without Borders in that area, and let me just say, Doctors Without Borders is worldwide, and where there's conflicts. The conflicts that were happening in Syria and that area, and the people that were moving to the side to get to Greece, I have to. The Greeks did all they could at that time that they really had time to do it. They went to the European Union. They were asking help from the United Nations and trying to get money. So they did all they could do at that time. But the NGOs, the non-government agencies that volunteer, started picking up the slack, and it with the reaching out to other people everywhere. And I was able to do that just because I just gotten out of the Air Force, and the whole event has exploded.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't that Greece wasn't friendly in any way. It's just they didn't have the capability
Mm-hmm.
to do the things that needed to be done. And mainland one thing, but the islands where the refugees were going and first getting on to out of where they're supposed to be, Syria, places like that. Let's just say Greece was not ready for that. The two islands were not ready for that.
To give a little context, it's similar to what you sometimes see with refugees leaving Cuba and coming into Florida.
Yes.
So they're kind of hitting the Keys first and then maybe moving into the mainland.
Yes, and I've been down to the Keys quite a bit. If you go out some of the Keys, you'll see boats, ships, boats and things like that that have been abandoned, and refugees had been in those, and somebody had obviously come and pick them up.
So the circumstances can be quite harrowing. The conversations that we've had, you told a story of that you weren't able to, and I just want to give you an opportunity to tell the story. You weren't able to actually go and take people from a boat. You had to have them come in to you before you could help them. So help me understand why that was and what that entailed.
Okay, when I was in Florida working with the sheriff and volunteer sheriff on a dive team, we had occasions to go out and people had drowned, and we would have to take a body bag with us. And that was because we had things that we had to do. When people are going from the coast of Turkey to the coast of Samos or even Lesbos, they just think that they could get there, they see land, and they could get out of the boat. And if they get out of the boat, they're going to get lost because the currents, at that time, the rocks, the environment is so bad that we want to get them away from getting out of the water. Now you can imagine you've been in Syria, or you're getting bombed or things like that, and you finally get to a place that you think is going to be helpful to you. So people would get out of the rafts not knowing the dangers that was there. So we were called spotters, and we would take a section of beach, and we would have our flashlights and our gear, and we had places designated for them to come in. And we had to make sure that when we saw the raft, we could get out to them and tell them, don't get out of the boat. And sometimes we were lucky, and sometimes we weren't.
So the tragedy of their circumstances compounded by their desire to find safe haven.
Yes, it's if you could imagine, or anybody could imagine, if I were to say to you right now, you've got 5 minutes to get your family and get out of this town right now, and you say, what, you got to go. And that's not, I'm not exaggerating, that's what happens. So they're finally getting to some freedom, they're getting some food and water, things like that. They're going to be anxious.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, unfortunately, just about every raft or boat that would come up to us at night and during the day, they had actually had people that passed away, and they tied their bodies to the raft. They did not want them in the ocean, and we understood that. So if we could get them to come into the area where we were trying to have them come in, then my job was to get body bags out to the boat and get the bodies into the body bags before anybody could know what's happening. Because it's very traumatic. It's so traumatic that you don't want to see people who just lost their father, their mother,
mm-hmm.
and they're finally in a new place, and you do everything you can to help them. So it would get cold, it would get really cold, but we would get over there, we'd get them out as soon as we could. And then the body bags that we had taken, we'd get into a boat and get them out of there.
again, I mean, it's stark hearing it firsthand. Because you can watch documentaries and you can get a sense of, okay, there's something, this is not right, and there's a problem here.
Just,
But until you have the conversation and you actually hear it firsthand, someone who's had, you've seen the bodies next to the rafts, and you've seen, I'm sure, the types of injuries and the types of things that people come to you with. For instance, I think one of the things you mentioned was with Syria, that because a lot of times they were using chemical weapons in
yes.
Syria, and you would find chemical burns and things of that nature on people, trying to flee that circumstance.
Yes, yeah. In those cases, because of the war and the bombs and shells and bullets and things like that would tear up a body, and orthopedically, there was nothing they're fleeing, so there's nothing they could do till they got to us. After we got them out of the boat, we would get them to a tent, and at that tent we would try to take and see how bad they were, what was traumatic, what was not, and we would take them that way. Now you got to remember, if they were out of the boat and one of them had injuries, for instance, mustard gas, you inhale it, it burns your lungs. So how do you treat that? Well, you have to have oxygen. But we were refugees, or they were refugees, and we're volunteers.
Mm-hmm.
We would try to get oxygen tanks and things like that. Sometimes we would, other times we wouldn't. With the orthopedic injuries, we had doctors that knew how to set things, so that we got them to that. They could set them, and we could bandage them. And I did a lot of wound care at the time, also triage. So there were everything, including children, that were in such a bad way that we had to put our emotions away and be as warming and as loving as we could be, and in the meantime, help them do what they need to get done.
Were you able to draw on the same skill? Because, I mean, between adults, we recognize that the military, there are decisions that need to be made during military service, especially in any kind of combat situation, that could involve the loss of life. And in many instances, I've read that, for instance, pilots, jet fighters, tend to concentrate on the task at hand, the flying of the plane and the targeting and things of that nature, and not necessarily think about what the ramifications of the actions that they're taking necessarily are. It sounds to me like you're able to make that distinction, like you were able to separate yourself. You're obviously someone who's very sympathetic,
Yes.
And who really does have that empathy for the individuals and the circumstance they're in, but you also recognize the mission at hand.
Yes.
And I'm assuming you're able to draw on what you have from the military that helps you quite a bit, I would imagine, in these situations.
Whether it was the wound care or really it was the wound care and the treatment of the refugees. They had been treated so poorly before getting to where we were. We were, especially, it wasn't, I actually made it not known that I was actually military. After a while, if somebody asked me, I would say yes, but I'm retired. I actually preferred to be able to just be an American on the team, and that way there was no problem. Not that there would have been.
Right.
But everything that I had learned, as you just mentioned, is as we get to a situation, we know what we have to do, whether it's the setting of bones or working with other things. I think one of the worst things that happened was as we got them into the camps, and what was so bad about the camps, they were unprepared for the amount of refugees coming in. Refugees were getting cardboard. If they could find metal, they had to build their own.
Like a shanty.
A shanty, exactly. They'd find tarps and things like that, just because Greece was not ready for the amount of people coming in. I would believe on Samos they were ready. They could probably take 2,000 to 3,000, but they ended up with close to 6,000, 7,000. So the water situation was terrible. Sanitation and then food was so bad. And what I'm getting to is when I did wound care, I did a lot of bug bites and bug infections with bug bites. We had rat bites, and I treated a lot of those. And for me, working with a 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old who's got rat bites and bug bites, and they're infected, it was just very hard to work.
Right.
Very much hard to work. So, because our protocol was, we really couldn't get in behind their families.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes down to talking between the two of us, a lot of times we had to have an interpreter. And then other times, one of us could help them with their speech. We knew what they meant. That was probably one of the toughest things that I had to do, was to work with the children.
And you had to say, I mean, obviously there's a I would think that there's a compelling human need, if you will, to be able to provide comfort. But you had to stay somewhat divorced from that, because you couldn't necessarily befriend these people, because in many instances it led to a situation that was not tenable, or they were taking advantage of that. Correct?
Yeah. One of the training things or training issues is you're there to help them medically. You're not there for the mental health. You're not anything else. You're just there to treat them. And in doing so, like for instance, I would treat a child with bug bites, and 2 days later, 3 days later, he or she had come back and they were more infected. So I would redo that. But the way they were living was being, I'm going to see her in 2 or 3 days anyway, again. Mm-hmm. So that was probably one of the hardest things was trying to put in motion. With 2 daughters of mine back in the States, and people that I knew, sometimes somebody would really get upset. Somebody on our team or another team. We could not get medical health people there. We needed people, therapists for the refugees, so much, and we just couldn't get them there.
So you deploy, for lack of better terms, with the Doctors Without Borders every you're embedded for 6 months. Is that about right?
Actually, we would go 3 to 4 times a year.
Okay.
We would like to stay with the same team, and then we would go for a month to 6 weeks.
Okay, so about 6 weeks.
Yeah.
All right. So,
and we're paying for everything on us.
That's where I was going with this. Yeah. If none of this is state sponsored, none of this is it's all charitable. Mm-hmm. It's all done through volunteerism.
Yes. It's
all done voluntarily.
NGO, non-governmental organizations.
Okay, all right.
So the airfare and staying at a hoot someplace, rental car, and because I had retired from the Air Force, there were things that I could do. Most of the time, I would go ahead and get a rental car, and I would get something that could carry 3 or 4 people. If I could get a van or something like that, then that would be helpful for the whole team and everything else. Mm-hmm. Trips to the beach when we could get there, but that was another way that we would help each other with the vehicles. Sometimes we would try to play some games, get away, go to the beach, and just take some downtime, mm-hmm. Which we would need. We would need desperately.
Yeah, no, I can only imagine. So again, the organization itself is not something that, again, we spoke of this earlier, not very well known to most Americans. As a matter of fact, one of the comments that you made was that sometimes you find it a little bit disappointing that there are not more Americans volunteering with Doctors Without Borders. Would you say that's a component of the fact that there's really not, relatively speaking, there's not a refugee crisis in America on our borders, for instance?
I would say yes, but the southern border is probably as close as you can get.
Right.
Texas and the border down there, and it's getting ready to get even worse.
And to that point, I mean, that's the reason that I bring it up. I was just hoping that you might go there. When we look at that, obviously that is the individuals who are fleeing the circumstances that they're in. It's a similar parallel. It's parallel. it may not be war, it may not be a destructive scenario per se, but if you look at Central American refugees, they're generally fleeing gang warfare or a narcotraffico warfare. So while there's similarities, your experience obviously is something that is far more dire, I would think, overall. Or is that not true? Is it?
I think it is true.
Okay.
The situation down there is so political, and it's political on both sides. And if I had the opportunity to go back to Greece or to go to the border, I would go back to Greece.
Okay.
And because there's really people down there that know what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
They're maybe fleeing political reasons, but it's not as bad as going back to Greece and Syria and places like that.
Comparatively speaking, too, the United States has the wherewithal to be able to manage those types of things. And in the situations you're in Greece, and I'm sure the refugee camps in Afghanistan, refugee camps.
We are getting a lot of Afghan refugees and even Iranian refugees. So when we go back probably the first part of the year, that's probably where we're going to see a lot of that. Again, just as you think it's going to settle down, there's a rush coming in. And I would say the NGOs that are there have experience. There is a process they have to follow through the UN to get permission to go down and set up. And they're pretty hard over on people that can go down there. It's not a place to go down. It's at the border. It's very much political. It is political in the refugee camps, but the country of Greece, the UN, EAU, things like that, are, I would say, they have the capability to make this better. But when you have a refugee family that fled Syria after being bombed or gassed, and they're in this camp made of cardboard boxes, and they're there for a year or 2 years, there's going to be explosions. And there have been times when, and that's one of the things we're also trained. If there's a horn that goes off, depending on how many times it goes off, we have to go someplace that's safe, or we have to go some other place. We have crime, but not like you're going to have it down at the border.
Mm-hmm.
And if you put yourself in the shoes of a husband and wife who've left Syria with 2 kids, and they're your family, and you've left family back in Syria, you're wanting to get out of there as fast as you can. They get frustrated. They will have protests, but the protests are in the camp or just outside the camp. They have to have advocates outside. And I'm pretty sure Doctors Without Borders are not doing that, but the UN High Commissioner for Refugees is doing something about it. It's just not fast enough.
Well, I mean, it's terribly fascinating. It truly, truly is. And while I thanked you for your service to the country, I also want to thank you for your service to the world. I mean, that's just... I just find it fascinating that people like you live right down the street. To me, it kind of goes back to the we were talking about this a couple of days ago. Sesame Street, they used to always say, who are the people in your neighborhood? Well, that's one of the things that I try to do with this podcast, is introduce people to the people in their neighborhood. And there's a double effort here. There's 2 efforts involved. Number one is I want to highlight people like you who are doing great things.
I appreciate that.
I also want to point out the fact that meet your neighbors. Learn your community. Know who the people who are around you. And there's going to be all sorts of opportunities. So I would say to the people who might be listening or watching the podcast, if you're interested, if they see this and they're moved and they say, you know what, I want to find out how I can help Doctors Without Borders, or maybe be of help to Doctors Without Borders. Maybe there's someone in our community who is a mental health expert or does have the type of qualifications that would be interested in maybe making this part of their own philanthropy their own philanthropic efforts. How would they go about doing that?
Well, I'm in a position so if they contact me, and you provide the phone number and email addresses, if you would, then I can help them get over the processes that I take to get places. COVID was another issue that was not as bad because they were on an island, and we really didn't have to go through a lot of those protocols. Mm-hmm. Some people did. If somebody that wants to go over can contact me, then I will tell them. I will meet with them, tell them the process, try to explain them to them, and even next time I'm going, if they want to go with me at that time, I have no problem with that.
Okay, that's fantastic. Also, for those who might want to contribute from a financial perspective, mm-hmm. one of the things that you pointed out was that 85% of all the proceeds that are gathered through, the volunteers mm-hmm. and through any kind of fundraising efforts, 85% of that goes to the programs themselves.
Yes.
So this is all used to fund the process of
mm-hmm.
Doctors Without Borders. 14% of that goes back to the actual fundraising process, which mm-hmm. costs money.
Yeah.
And then only 1% of all of that monies that are raised actually goes towards management and general.
We get a lot of volunteers that want to do that. They can't go overseas, but they want help.
Right.
So admin and things like that are folks that we desperately need, and we always appreciate it when they.
Fantastic. Well, what I'm going to do for folks watching and listening is that I am going to list all of the appropriate contacts and links for Doctors Without Borders at the end of the podcast. You can also, I'm going to take the extra, I've just thought of this, I'm going to take the extra step of adding Doctors Without Borders to the Lean and Leander website. So I'll put some direct links there as well so people can look at my site, go directly to Doctors Without Borders. Yes. You guys are becoming my unofficial philanthropy, if you will. But this has been fascinating, Dee, and I am thrilled beyond thrills, to be honest, to have met you. I consider it a blessing for me, and anything that I can do to help you out in the long run, short of going to Greece,
yes.
I'm happy to do so.
Not a problem.
All right, fantastic. Thanks for your time.
You bet.
If you are interested in donating to Doctors Without Borders, you can actually make a monthly contribution if you visit donate.doctorswithoutborders.org. There are a lot of other ways you can actually support this very worthy organization, so feel free to navigate around on that site or the main website, doctorswithoutborders.org. Keep in mind that Doctors Without Borders uses 85% of the donations towards the program operation. Only 14% goes to fundraising, and a mere 1% of your donation will go to the management and general operation over the organization. Everybody who participates in this organization is a volunteer, and they use their own time and their own money to support this very worthy cause. If this is something that interests you and you'd like to make a charitable contribution over the holiday, or perhaps on an ongoing basis, I encourage you to do so.